The wind was a restless thing. It scoured the high desert of the New Mexico territory, carrying dust from the flats and the scent of sage from the hills. It was a lonely sound, the only sound for miles, and it had been Eli Barrett's sole companion for 2 years, the wind and the ghosts. His ranch was a hard-won piece of earth, cupped in a shallow valley with a creek that ran thin in the dry months. The cabin was sturdy, built of cottonwood logs he and his brother, Jacob, had hauled down from the mountains. The barn leaned a little, a testament to a winter storm that had nearly taken it. Everything on the property, from the sagging fence line to the deep-set lines around Eli's own gray eyes, was weathered by sun and sorrow. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder but thinned by work and grief, his movements economical and quiet. He moved as if noise was a resource he could not afford to spend. 2 years. 2 years since the Chiricahua had come down from the rocks at dawn. They had not been a war party, just a handful of hungry, desperate men pushed to the edge. But desperation was a sharp blade. Eli had been miles away, checking a line camp. He returned to silence, a silence louder than any scream. He found Jacob by the half-finished well, and he found Martha, his fiancée, near the cabin door, her hand still outstretched as if reaching for something she'd dropped. He buried them both under the lone juniper tree that clung to the ridge overlooking the ranch. He said no words, because words had fled him. They had been gone for 2 years. Since then, the world had shrunk to the size of his property lines. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight. Every evening, he would sit at the rough-hewn table Jacob had built, a single plate before him, and the 2 empty chairs would accuse him. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a hollow ache in his chest, a constant reminder of what was lost. He spoke only to his horse and the cattle, and their answers were not enough to keep the ghosts at bay. He was not a man built for solitude, but solitude was all he had left. He was 34 years old and felt 100. The ranch was failing, not from lack of work. He worked until his hands bled and his back screamed, but from lack of a future. A man alone could hold the land, but he could not make it grow. He needed help. More than that, he needed to hear a human voice in the evening that was not just a memory. The decision came to him one night as a coyote cried on the ridge. Its call so full of desolation it sounded like his own soul had been given voice. He rode into the nearest town, a dusty collection of adobe buildings called Redemption, and went to the telegraph office. He felt a fool. He felt like a man admitting defeat. He wrote the words out on a slip of paper, his handwriting clumsy and thick from holding reins and branding irons. Not a pen. Widower rancher seeks wife, plain, honest, hard-working woman for partnership in land and life. Must be willing to face hardship, will provide home, protection, and loyalty. Eli Barrett, Bar B Ranch, via Redemption, New Mexico territory. He did not write of love. Love was a ghost, buried on the hill. He wrote of partnership, a word solid and practical, like fence posts and leather. He paid the man, handed over the paper without meeting his eyes, and rode back into the silence of his own life, feeling the shame and the hope warring inside him. It was a desperate gamble, a message in a bottle cast into the vast, uncaring ocean of the East. He did not truly expect an answer. Far away in the green, humid hills of Missouri, Claire Whitmore read the advertisement in a month-old copy of a matrimonial circular. Her hands trembled, smudging the cheap ink. Each word seemed to speak directly to her own desperation. Plain, honest, hard-working. She felt she was all of those things, willing to face hardship. Hardship was a familiar acquaintance. Claire had been a schoolteacher, beloved by her students and respected in her small town. Her world had been one of books, quiet walks, and the gentle rhythm of the seasons. Then, Mr. Abernathy, a married trustee of the school and a man of supposed standing, had taken an inappropriate interest in her. She had rebuffed his advances, gently at first, then firmly. He had persisted, his pride wounded. his whispers turning to threats. He began to tell stories. He spoke of secret meetings, of letters she never wrote, of affections she never returned. In a town hungry for scandal, the whispers became a roar. She was branded. The women of the town, who had once smiled at her, now crossed the street to avoid her. The school board dismissed her, citing a collapse of moral character. Her ruin was complete when Mr. Abernathy, consumed by his own lies and the fear of their discovery, took his own life in his study. His final act was not a confession that would clear her name, but a final, damning anchor that tied her to his sin. They called her a temptress, a homewrecker, a woman whose vanity had driven a good man to despair. The truth did not matter. Her reputation was a corpse, and she was forced to live beside it. Eli Barrett's advertisement was not a promise of romance. It was an offer of escape, New Mexico territory. The name itself sounded like a blank page, a place so vast and empty it could swallow her past whole, a place where no one knew her name or the lies that clung to it. She looked at her reflection in the wavy glass of her window, a pale woman of 28, with serious brown eyes and hair the color of dried corn silk pulled back in a severe bun, plain, honest. She could offer this man a clean house, a mended shirt, a listening ear. She could teach his children, if he had any. She could build a life from the ashes of her old one. In return, she asked only for a place to be anonymous, a place to be useful, a place to stop feeling the constant, burning heat of shame. She penned her reply with a careful, steady hand, enclosed a small, severe photograph of herself, and sent it west, her entire future sealed inside the thin paper envelope. On the very same stagecoach that rattled and swayed across the plains, carrying Claire Whitmore toward her new life, another woman sat with a copy of the very same advertisement tucked into her bodice. But this woman was nothing like Claire. Her name was Ruby Marlowe, and she was a flame where Claire was a shadow. Ruby's hair was the color of dark whiskey, piled in a cascade of curls that not even the dust of the trail could tame. Her eyes were a startling green, quick and intelligent, missing nothing. Her dress, though travel-worn, was of a deep scarlet silk that clung to curves she made no effort to hide. She had the scent of cheap perfume and expensive trouble about her. Ruby was not responding to the ad. She was hijacking it. The original letter of acceptance, the one Eli Barrett had sent to a woman in Kansas, was ashes in a fire pit miles back. Ruby had her own copy, forged in a back room in Dodge City by a man with shaky hands and a thirst for the bottle. She had paid him with her last dollar and a kiss that left him breathless. She was running from a man named Jude Laskin, a gambler with eyes as cold as a river in winter and hands that were only gentle when they were holding winning cards. She had been his prize, his singer in the saloon where he ran his crooked games. He had dressed her in silks and jewels, but the finery was just a gilded cage. His affection was a fist, his love a brand. She had finally fled after a night of terror that left her with a bruised cheek and a soul that had screamed enough. She had seen the matrimonial circular by chance, and Eli Barrett's ad had not spoken to her of partnership, but of sanctuary. A rancher, a widower, a man alone in the middle of nowhere. Such a man would be lonely. Such a man would be grateful. Ruby knew men. She knew their hungers, the ones they spoke of and the ones they kept locked away in the dark. She could not cook or clean or tend to livestock. She could not offer quiet dignity, but she could offer a fire to a man who was freezing to death. She could make him forget his ghosts for a few hours at a time. It was a currency she understood, a skill she had honed for survival. She would use her charm, her body, her wits, whatever it took to win herself a safe harbor. She looked across the rocking coach at the pale, frightened woman in the drab brown dress, the one clutching her reticule like a prayer book, and felt a brief, sharp pang of something that might have been pity, or perhaps contempt. The world ate women like that for breakfast. The storm hit them 10 miles from redemption. The sky, which had been a vast, bleached blue, turned the color of a bruise. The wind rose to a shriek, and rain came down in sheets. turning the dusty road into a river of thick, red mud. The stagecoach lurched and slid, the horses whinnying in protest. Inside, Claire gripped her seat, her knuckles white, her face pale with fear. Ruby, however, seemed to come alive. She watched the lightning split the sky, a small, knowing smile on her lips. A storm was a fitting welcome. Eli saw the coach from the cabin window, its lamps, two blurry yellow eyes struggling through the downpour. He had received the letter of acceptance weeks ago, from a Miss Eleanor Vance of Kansas. He had been expecting her, his heart hammered against his ribs, a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. He pulled on his coat, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The driver was shouting curses into the wind as he fought to control the terrified horses. Eli grabbed a bridle, his voice a low, calming rumble that cut through the noise. He helped the man get the team settled. "Got a passenger for you. Barrett," the driver yelled over the wind. "Your mail-order bride." The coach door swung open. The first to emerge was Claire. She hesitated on the step, clutching her bag, her thin dress already soaked. She looked small and fragile against the vast, violent landscape. Eli moved to help her down, his hand closing over her arm. She was trembling. "Mr. Barrett?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am," he said, his own voice rusty from disuse. He started to lead her toward the faint light of the cabin. But then another figure appeared in the doorway of the coach. Ruby stepped down into the mud, her red dress plastered to her body, her hair a wild, dark tangle around her face. She held no bag. She looked at Eli, and her green eyes seemed to burn through the rain and the gloom. She held up a folded, damp piece of paper. "Eli Barrett?" she asked, her voice a low, smoky purr that carried over the storm. "I'm here. I'm your bride." Eli stopped dead. He looked from the pale, trembling woman whose arm he held to the defiant, rain-soaked vision in red. He looked at the paper in Ruby's hand, then at the identical letter he knew was tucked in Claire's bag. The stagecoach driver, oblivious, tipped his hat and began the struggle of turning his team around, eager to get back to town. Silence descended, a pocket of stunned disbelief in the heart of the storm. The rain hammered down, the wind howled. Eli looked at the two women, both claiming the same future, both staring at him with a desperate hope that mirrored his own. He led them inside the cabin. The room was small and spare, dominated by a stone hearth where a low fire sputtered, a table, two chairs, a bed in one corner, a pallet of blankets in another. It was a room built for one, that had once held three, and now was impossibly crowded with five. Himself, two strange women, and the two ghosts who watched from the shadows. He took their wet coats. Claire stood shivering by the fire, her eyes darting around the spare room, taking in the poverty, the loneliness of it all. Ruby stood in the center of the floor, water pooling at her feet, her gaze fixed on Eli. She was not shivering. She looked as if she were taking his measure, cataloging his strengths and weaknesses. "There's been a mistake," Eli finally managed to say. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "There's no mistake, Mr. Barrett," Claire said softly, finding her voice. She pulled her letter from her bag. "This is your letter. I am Claire Whitmore." "The letter was sent to Eleanor Vance," Ruby cut in smoothly, holding up her own forged copy. "My friends call me Ruby. Eleanor is my given name. This is my letter." Eli looked from one genuine signature to the other. He was a simple man. He understood cattle, weather, the language of the land. He did not understand this. He did not understand the currents of deceit and desperation that had washed these two impossibly different women onto his shore. His mind, accustomed to solitude, simply shut down. He could not process the complexity of it. He could not untangle the truth from the lie. He could not send one of them, or both, back out into that storm. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and something else, the faint, floral scent of Claire's soap and the muskier, spicier perfume that clung to Ruby. "The stage won't be back for a week," he said, his voice flat. "You can't go back tonight." He gestured to the pallet of blankets. "One of you can take that, the other, the loft." He pointed to a ladder leading to a small, dark space above. "I'll sleep in the barn." He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed a spare blanket, took his rifle from its pegs on the wall, and walked out the door, back into the cleansing violence of the storm. He left them there, two strangers under his roof, their animosity and fear a palpable thing in the small, firelit space. He made his way to the barn, the wind tearing at him. Inside, the familiar smell of hay and livestock was a comfort. He climbed to the hayloft, wrapped himself in the scratchy wool blanket, and lay down, listening to the storm rage outside and the even greater storm that had just broken inside his life. The wind howled over the empty land, a mournful cry that echoed the desolation in his own heart. Coyotes answered from the hills, their voices thin and wild, out there in the vast, dark expanse of the west. 3 lonely souls lay awake, each trapped in a silence of their own making, listening to the rain and wondering what terrors the dawn would bring. The dawn broke cold and clean, washing the landscape in a pale, unforgiving light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed raw. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick with the things left unsaid the night before. Eli came in from the barn, smelling of hay and wet earth, and found the 2 women already awake. They moved around the small space like wary cats, careful not to touch, their orbits defined by the silent tension between them. Claire had risen first. She had found the sack of flour and a tin of coffee, and by the time Eli entered, a pot was brewing on the hearth and the beginnings of biscuits were taking shape on a floured board. She wore one of her 2 simple dresses, a gray calico that seemed to absorb the dim light of the cabin. Her movements were precise and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of their arrival. She offered him a cup of coffee without a word, her eyes downcast, and in that simple gesture, she made her case. She was offering order. She was offering a home. Ruby emerged from the loft a short time later, yawning as if she had not a care in the world. She wore a silk dressing gown, a garment so out of place in the rustic cabin it was almost scandalous. It was the color of a summer sky, and it clung to her as she stretched, her arms reaching for the ceiling. She ignored the coffee and the biscuit dough completely. Instead, she walked to the cabin's single bucket of fresh water, dipped a cloth in it, and began to wash her face and neck with slow, deliberate movements, her eyes finding Eli's in the small, cracked mirror he kept by the door. Her message was just as clear as Claire's. She was offering a different kind of warmth, a fire to match the one in the hearth. Eli drank his coffee standing up, his back to them both, and ate a biscuit that was surprisingly light. He said nothing. He felt their eyes on him, felt their unspoken questions, and he had no answers. He finished his meal, took his hat, and went out to inspect the storm's damage. The silence of the open land a welcome reprieve, his loneliness, which had been a dull, constant ache for 2 years, had sharpened overnight. It was now an acute pain, a wound torn open by the presence of these 2 women and the life they represented. In the days that followed, the unspoken battle lines were drawn. Claire claimed the domestic sphere as her battlefield. She cleaned the cabin with a ferocity that was almost desperate, scrubbing away years of dust and bachelor neglect. She mended Eli's torn shirts, her stitches small and even. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and began to tend it. Her hands, soft from a life of books, quickly becoming calloused and scratched. She learned the quirks of the temperamental wood stove, and soon the cabin was filled with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew. She even made an attempt with the livestock, trying to milk the single cow with a clumsy determination that ended with a kicked-over pail and her skirt splattered with mud. She did not complain. She simply went back the next day and tried again. In the evenings, she would sit by the fire, a book open in her lap. She had brought 3 with her, and the quiet, literate calm she exuded was a stark contrast to the wildness outside. She was offering him a life like the one he had planned with Martha, a life of gentle companionship and shared burdens. Ruby, meanwhile, waged a different kind of war. She treated the ranch not as a place of work, but as a stage. She had no interest in cooking or cleaning. Her fine dresses were entirely impractical, yet she wore them daily, their bright colors a defiant splash against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. She would spend hours brushing her dark, lustrous hair, humming saloon tunes under her breath. She followed Eli as he worked, not offering to help, but simply to watch, her presence a constant, silent invitation. She mocked Claire's efforts with a subtle, cutting wit. My schoolteacher," she'd say, watching Claire scrub a pot. "You'll scour the soul right out of that thing." Her most audacious performance came a few days into their strange cohabitation. The afternoon was hot and still. Eli was repairing a section of fence that bordered the creek, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only sound in the vast silence. He heard a splash and looked up, downstream, in a pool where the water was deep and clear. Ruby was bathing. She had shed her dress and stood in her chemise, the wet fabric clinging to her like a second skin. She moved with a languid, unhurried grace, pouring water over her shoulders, her head thrown back, her eyes closed. It was not an act of hygiene. It was a deliberate, shameless display. She knew he was there. She knew he was watching. He felt a hot flush of something, anger, confusion, desire, creep up his neck. He turned back to his fence, his hammer blows coming faster now, harder, as if he could pound the image from his mind. He did not look up again. Claire saw it all from the cabin door. She saw the flash of Ruby's wet skin, and she saw the rigid set of Eli's shoulders as he turned away. The rejection she felt was a cold, bitter stone in her stomach. It was not just about Eli. It was a confirmation of a deeper, more painful wound. The memory would come to her at night, in the quiet of the loft, as she lay listening to the coyotes cry. She would see Mr. Abernathy's face, his eyes damp with a self-pity she had mistaken for kindness. He was a pillar of the community, a married man with grown children, a trustee of her school. He had praised her teaching, brought her small gifts, a book of poetry, a flower from his wife's garden. She had been naive. She had not understood the nature of his attention until he had trapped her in the empty schoolhouse one afternoon, his hand closing over hers, his breath smelling of whiskey and desperation. "Claire, you are so pure," he had whispered, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "A man could lose himself in your goodness." She had pulled her hand away, horrified. She had told him, in a firm, shaking voice, to never speak to her that way again. But the rejection had not deterred him. It had inflamed him. His wounded pride had turned venomous. The whispers started soon after. He told people she had led him on, that her quiet nature was a clever guise for a calculating heart. The town, eager for a villain, believed him. The shame was a physical thing, a constant heat on her skin. She felt their eyes on her in the street, heard their hushed condemnations in the general store. The final, crushing blow came when the sheriff arrived at her boarding house to tell her that Mr. Abernathy had shot himself. A note on his desk blamed his despair on an unrequited, torturous love for her. She had not seduced him, but she had, in their eyes, killed him. She carried that judgment with her every day. She had come west to escape it, but now, watching Ruby's blatant seduction and Eli's conflicted response, she felt the old shame rise up like bile. She was the plain, proper woman a man might respect, but never truly want. Ruby knew nothing of Claire's ghosts, but she was an expert at sensing a man's. She chose her moment carefully. It was a cool evening, the sky a deep, star-littered indigo. Claire had gone to bed early, weary from her labors. Eli sat outside the cabin, cleaning his rifle, the methodical task a way to quiet his mind. Ruby came and sat on the step near him, not too close, but close enough that he could smell her perfume. For a long time, she was silent. Then she began to speak, her voice low and soft. She told him about her life, or rather, a carefully edited version of it. She spoke of singing in saloons, of the bright lights and the loud music. She painted a picture of a young, naive girl trapped in a gilded cage, forced to smile and sing for leering men. She spoke of one man in particular, a man who had promised her protection but had offered only ownership. She did not mention Jude Laskin by name, nor did she speak of his violence. She spoke only of a deep loneliness, of feeling like a pretty bird in a cage, admired but never truly seen. It was a masterful performance, designed to echo what she sensed in him, a profound and aching solitude. As she spoke, she reached out, as if by accident, and her fingers brushed the back of his hand where it rested on the rifle stock. His skin was rough, calloused. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. The touch was electric, a spark in the vast, dark emptiness of his life. "It must be hard," she whispered, her voice dropping even lower, becoming intimate and conspiratorial. "Being so alone out here. A man can freeze from the inside out." She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "I know how to warm a man who's frozen inside. Eli." He stood up abruptly then, his chair scraping against the hard-packed earth. "I have to check on the horses," he muttered, and disappeared into the darkness of the barn, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. But her words followed him. They wrapped around him in the dark, a promise of a heat he had almost forgotten existed. The breaking point came a week later. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in the black sky, so bright it cast sharp shadows on the ground. The air was cool and still. Eli couldn't sleep. He left the barn and walked toward the creek, needing the sound of the water to soothe the turmoil in his head. And then he saw her. Ruby was by the water's edge, washing clothes. She was on her knees, scrubbing a shirt against a smooth, flat rock. It was a strangely domestic scene, so at odds with the woman he thought he knew. Her sleeves were rolled up, her arms pale and slender in the moonlight. She looked up as he approached, her eyes luminous in the dark. She did not seem surprised to see him. She rose to her feet, wiping her wet hands on her skirt. The moonlight caught the damp fabric, making it translucent. He could see the shape of her legs, the curve of her hip. She took a step toward him, then another. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice soft. He just shook his head, unable to find words. His throat was dry. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She looked up into his face, her expression stripped of all artifice. In the stark moonlight, he saw not a temptress, but a woman who was as lost and lonely as he was. He saw a hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with seduction and everything to do with a desperate need for human contact. "Eli," she said, her voice barely a breath. She reached up and placed her hand flat on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the trembling in her fingers, or perhaps it was his own trembling he felt. "You don't have to be alone tonight." It was not a question. It was an offer of shared oblivion, and he was too weak, too starved, too broken to refuse. The ghost of Martha, the quiet hope of Claire, the 2 long years of celibate grief, it all shattered in that moment. He reached for her, his hands fumbling at her waist, pulling her against him. His mouth found hers in a kiss that was not tender or loving, but desperate and hungry. A collision of 2 solitudes. It was a raw, aching release of pressure, a frantic search for warmth in the cold, lonely dark. Afterward, he pulled away from her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Confusion and a deep, gut-wrenching shame washed over him. He looked at her wild hair and kiss-swollen lips, and he felt like a stranger to himself. Without a word, he turned and walked back to the barn. the weight of his betrayal a crushing load on his shoulders. For the next several days, he avoided her. He avoided them both. He rose before dawn and returned after dark, losing himself in the hardest physical labor he could find, trying to exhaust the turmoil from his body and mind. But the silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just tense. It was poisoned. Claire saw it instantly. She saw the way Ruby now walked with a new, feline confidence, a secret knowledge in her eyes. She saw the way Eli could not bring himself to look at Ruby, his gaze always sliding away. And she saw the way he could not look at her either, his face a mask of guilt and confusion. The rejection was a physical blow. It was the schoolhouse all over again. The shame she had tried to bury in the hard New Mexico soil had been unearthed. The competition was over. She had lost. The quiet dignity she had clung to felt like a fool's armor. A subtle but corrosive contempt began to grow in her heart, for the woman who had won, for the man who had chosen, and most of all, for herself. The land remained dry. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth until it cracked. The work was hard and endless, and inside the small cabin, 3 people were trapped in a silent, simmering hell of their own making, their tempers boiling just beneath the surface, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would erupt. The fragile truce held for nearly a month, a thin sheet of ice over a boiling river. The days fell into a hard, monotonous rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Eli worked from dawn until dusk, seeking exhaustion as a man might seek salvation. Claire continued her quiet siege of the domestic, her efforts a constant, silent reproach, and Ruby watched, a predator waiting for the right moment, her very presence a challenge to the fragile peace. The break came in the form of a lanky, sun-scorched ranch hand named Silas, who worked for a larger outfit to the south. He rode in one sweltering afternoon leading a pack mule laden with supplies Eli had ordered weeks ago, sacks of flour, salt, and cartridges. He swung down from his horse, a wide, gap-toothed grin on his face as he saw Eli. "Barrett, good to see you're still letting the buzzards starve," he called out. His grin faltered as Claire emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. His eyes widened. "Well now, don't that beat all? Heard you was getting some help. Didn't figure it'd be this pleasant." His surprise turned to outright shock when Ruby appeared in the doorway behind Claire, a scarlet ribbon tied in her dark hair. Silas's jaw went slack. He stared at Ruby, his eyes narrowing in a slow, dawning recognition. The friendly gossip died on his lips. He unloaded the supplies in a tense, hurried silence, accepted the payment from Eli, and prepared to leave. Eli walked him to his horse. "Everything all right?" "Silas?" he asked, sensing the shift in the man. Silas didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the cabin, on the shadow in the doorway where Ruby stood watching. "Just be careful, Eli," he said, his voice low. "That's all." "Careful of what?" Silas finally turned, his gaze hard. He leaned in closer. "That dark-haired one, I seen her before. Dodge City, sang at a place called the Gilded Cage. She was Jude Laskin's girl." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Laskin ain't the kind of man who lets go of his property. She's trouble, Eli. The kind that follows a woman like that ain't the kind you want on your land." He swung himself up into the saddle, gave a curt nod, and rode away without looking back, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy poison in the air. That night, the silence at the dinner table was unbearable. Claire could feel the tension coming off Eli in waves. He pushed the food around on his plate, his jaw tight, after the meal, as Claire was clearing the dishes. Eli looked at Ruby. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and hard. He jerked his head toward the door. Outside, the last light of day was bleeding from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange. Eli faced her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a grim mask. "Jude Laskin? Who is he?" Ruby did not flinch. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might lie, might spin another one of her carefully crafted stories. Instead, she told him the truth, or a version of it. "He's a gambler," she said, her voice steady. "He owned the saloon where I sang. He owned the dress I wore. He thought he owned me." A flicker of something dark and fearful crossed her face before she mastered it. "I left. He doesn't like it when things he considers his go missing. The man, Silas, he said he'd come for you." "He will," she said. It was not a confession. It was a statement of fact. "Sooner or later, he'll find me. Men like Jude always do." A cold fury rose in Eli. He had been played for a fool. This was not about loneliness or seeking a new life. This was about a woman running from a dangerous past. A woman who had brought that danger right to his door, to the one place on earth he had left to protect. "You lied to me," he said, his voice a low growl. "You came here under false pretenses, bringing your trouble with you. Trouble I didn't ask for." "Everyone in this God-forsaken territory is running from something," she shot back, her own anger flaring. "What about you, Eli? Hiding out here with your ghosts? At least my trouble is alive and breathing. You could send me away. Put me on the next stage. Let him find me. Is that what you want?" He stared at her, at the defiance in her eyes, and saw the raw fear beneath it. He thought of sending her away, of putting her on a stagecoach and washing his hands of her and her problems. But then he pictured her alone, pictured a man like Laskin finding her. He had seen men like that. He had seen what they did to people who crossed them. A part of him, a part he thought had died with Martha and Jacob, could not do it. It was not forgiveness. It was a weary, grudging acceptance of a burden he did not want. "Get inside," he said, turning his back on her. "I'll deal with it if he comes." He didn't send her away. The next evening, it was Claire who confronted him. She found him in the barn, sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the quiet space. She stood before him, her hands clasped together, her face pale but resolute. There were tears glistening in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "I know what she is," Claire said quietly. "I know you've been with her. I am not a fool. Mr. Barrett." Eli stopped his work, the silence rushing in to fill the void. He could not meet her eyes. "I offered you my honesty," she went on, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I offered you my loyalty. I offered you a life. It might not have been exciting, but it would have been decent. It would have been true." Her voice broke, thick with a pain that went far beyond this one man, this one ranch. "But you didn't want that. You chose what was easy. You chose a fever over a hearth. You chose her." "Claire, it's not that simple," he stammered, feeling helpless and ashamed. How could he explain the crushing loneliness, the desperate physical need that had overwhelmed him in a moment of weakness? How could he explain that it had meant nothing and everything all at once? "Isn't it?" she asked, a bitter sadness in her voice. "It seems very simple to me. I was willing to be your wife. She was willing to be your whore, and you made your choice." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the axe in his hands and the weight of her words crushing him. He tried to return to his routine, to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of the ranch, but the dynamic had shifted again. Ruby, emboldened by his decision not to send her away, grew more daring. She no longer waited for the moonlight. She sought him out in the harsh light of day, cornering him in the barn while he was mending harnesses, her hands trailing over his shoulders, her lips brushing against his ear. She would whisper to him, her words a mix of raw longing and things that made him flush with a shame that was almost indistinguishable from desire. Their encounters became more frequent, more desperate. It was no longer a search for comfort, but a frantic, almost violent, coupling in the hayloft or against the rough-hewn wall of a stall. It was a wordless, furious act, a way to burn off the anger and the fear and the confusion that churned inside him. Afterward, he would feel hollowed out, consumed by a self-loathing that was as vast as the desert sky. While Eli was caught in Ruby's storm, Claire was quietly undergoing a transformation. The heartbreak, instead of breaking her, began to temper her. The shame that had followed her from Missouri was burned away by the relentless New Mexico sun. She stopped trying to win the battle for the cabin and turned her attention to the land itself. She asked Eli to teach her to ride properly, not side saddle like a lady, but astride like a man. He agreed, grudgingly at first, but he was surprised by her tenacity. She fell, she got back on. She was bruised and sore, but she never complained. She learned to shoot, practicing with an old rifle until her shoulder was purple, but her aim became steady. He would watch her from a distance, a small, determined figure in a gray dress, standing her ground against the vast emptiness, and a new kind of respect began to grow in him. He saw a strength in her he had never imagined, a core of prairie steel beneath the quiet, schoolteacher exterior. She was not just surviving, she was taking root. One morning, they were branding the new calves. It was hot, dirty, brutal work. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and burned hair. One of the calves broke free, and before Eli could react, Claire was there, grabbing a rope, her movements surprisingly deft. Heading the animal off, they worked together, a silent, efficient team. And for a few moments, the tension between them was forgotten, replaced by the shared language of hard work. When they were finished, they stood by the fire, exhausted and grimy. Eli looked at her, at the smudge of soot on her cheek and the newfound confidence in her eyes. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in the storm. She was someone else. She stepped closer to him, her gaze direct and unflinching. Before he understood what was happening, she reached up, put her hands on either side of his face, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion. It was hesitant, painful, charged with all the unspoken things between them. It tasted of salt and dust and 2 years of silence and a month of heartbreak. For a long second, he stood frozen, and then something inside him gave way. He did not pull away. He did not respond, but he did not pull away. The kiss changed everything. The triangle, which had been defined by his lust for one and his guilt toward the other, was now drawn taut with genuine emotion on all sides. Ruby saw it. She saw the way he looked at Claire now, the flicker of respect and a deeper, more confusing tenderness in his eyes. She saw the way Claire carried herself, no longer defeated, but with a quiet, burning strength. Ruby's seductions became sharper, more desperate, while Claire's presence became a slow-burning fire of emotional connection. Both women wanted him. Both women, in their own way, had begun to hate each other. The land, as if sensing the turmoil on its surface, turned against them. A dry lightning strike in the hills to the east started it. For a day, it was just a smudge of smoke on the horizon. But the wind shifted, and the smudge grew into a monstrous, churning cloud. A prairie fire. It came at them with terrifying speed. A roaring orange wall that devoured everything in its path. There was no time to think, only to act. "The horses!" Eli yelled, his voice raw against the roar of the flames. The barn, their last hope of shelter, was directly in the fire's path. He ran for the well, grabbing buckets, his mind a numb whirl of panic. As he worked, a wave of superheated air and thick, choking smoke rolled over him. He saw Claire, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror. But she was not running away. She was running toward the corral, toward the screaming, panicked horses. Without hesitation, she unlatched the gate, slapping the animals' rumps, driving them out into the open pasture, away from the barn and the approaching flames, risking being trampled in the chaos. At the same moment, Eli felt his lungs seize, The smoke was too thick. His vision swam, black spots dancing before his eyes. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his breath a ragged, useless gasp. He was going to die here, in the smoke and the fire, just feet from his own cabin. Through the haze, he saw a flash of scarlet. Ruby. She ran to him, her fine dress already singed at the hem. She grabbed him under the arms, her strength surprising, and dragged him, coughing and sputtering, away from the worst of the smoke, toward the relative safety of the creek bed. They huddled there, the three of them, as the fire front roared past, a wave of incandescent destruction. It took the barn, which went up in a geyser of sparks and flame. It licked at the cabin, but the wind shifted again at the last moment, and the main blaze swept past, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape in its wake. Afterward, in the eerie, smoky twilight, they stumbled back from the creek. The barn was a heap of glowing embers. The air was thick with the smell of ash. They were alive. The horses were alive. The cabin, miraculously, was still standing. They collapsed together on the hard-packed earth just inside the open doorway of the still intact horse stalls that were attached to the main barn, their bodies screaming with exhaustion and adrenaline. Claire began to weep, deep, shuddering sobs of terror and relief. Ruby, her face black with soot, her scarlet dress in tatters, just stared at the ruin of the barn and cursed, a single, foul word repeated over and over like a prayer. Eli, his lungs still aching, his mind still reeling, looked from the weeping woman who had saved his future to the cursing woman who had saved his life. He felt something break inside him. The walls he had built, the grief he had carried, the impossible choice he had been trying to make. He reached out in the smoky darkness. His hand found Claire's shoulder, pulling her toward him. He then reached for Ruby, his other arm wrapping around her waist. He pulled them both close, and in the ruins of his ranch, surrounded by the devastation, he kissed Claire's tear-streaked cheek, and then he turned and pressed his lips to Ruby's, tasting the ash and the fury. He kissed them both, and in the dark, for the first time, neither of them pulled away. The fire had taken the barn, and with it, Eli's refuge. He moved his bedroll into the main cabin, laying it out near the hearth, the small, one-room space, which had once felt merely small, now felt suffocating. Privacy was a luxury they no longer had. It was a ghost, like so many other things. In the dark, they could hear every rustle of a blanket, every sigh, every restless turn. The thin floorboard separating the main room from the loft where Claire slept did little to muffle sound. Ruby's pallet was a few feet from Eli's. They were three solitary islands forced into a single, churning sea. The dynamic, once a tense triangle of silent competition, shifted into something more dangerous. The air grew thick with unspoken thoughts, with the raw, volatile energy of three people trapped not just by circumstance, but by their own tangled needs. It was emotionally treacherous, a landscape of hidden cliffs and sudden storms, and at the center of it was a current of profound, unnerving intimacy that none of them knew how to navigate. They were witnesses to each other's waking and sleeping, to their moments of weariness and quiet despair. They were too close to pretend any longer. Ruby felt the change most acutely. She had won the first battle, the physical one, but she was losing the war. She saw the way Eli looked at Claire now, especially since the fire. It was not the look he gave her, a look of heat and hunger and a shame he tried to hide. With Claire, his gaze was different. It was quiet, steady, full of a grudging respect that was slowly softening into something that looked terrifyingly like affection. He watched Claire as she moved about the cabin, her movements now imbued with a new confidence. He noticed the way she'd learned to efficiently patch a fence, the way she spoke to the horses in a low, calming voice. He saw her strength, and it drew something out of him that Ruby's fire could not touch. The jealousy was a bitter, coiling thing in Ruby's gut. It was a familiar feeling, but this time it was different. She was not jealous of another woman's beauty or charm. She was jealous of her perceived goodness. One evening, after a long day of clearing blackened debris, she cornered Eli by the water bucket as Claire was up in the loft. "You love her, don't you?" she said, her voice a low, accusatory hiss. It was not a question. Eli sighed, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. He looked exhausted. "Ruby, don't." "Don't?" she scoffed, her green eyes flashing. "You look at her like she's a cool drink of water after a day in the desert. You look at me like I'm the whiskey you're ashamed of drinking in the dark." She took a step closer, her voice dropping, laden with a pain that was sharper than anger. "You love her because she's clean. She's the proper school teacher, the good woman who mends your shirts and reads her books. You love her purity, and you come to me when you're dirty. You use me to burn off the fever so you can go back to her and pretend to be a decent man." "That's not true," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Isn't it?" she pressed. "You think I don't know what I am to you? I'm the part of you that you hate, the part that survived when Martha and Jacob didn't, the part that's still hungry and alive and doesn't give a damn about what's proper. You can't live with it, but you can't live without it either." He had no answer for her, because, on some level, he knew she was right. He was torn between the woman who soothed his ghosts and the woman who made him forget them. He was caught between a life he thought he should want and a life his body seemed to crave. He tried to explain, to speak of gratitude for her saving him, of the confusion that knotted his insides, but the words were clumsy and inadequate. They fell like dead things between them, and she turned away from him in disgust. Claire, from the loft, had heard it all, every whispered, venomous word, and for the first time she felt a crack in the wall of her resentment toward Ruby. She heard the raw, desperate pain beneath the accusation. She began to see that Ruby's seductive armor was forged in a fire of her own, that her boldness was a shield against a world that had taught her she was only valuable for one thing. The shame Claire had carried from Missouri was the shame of being falsely judged. Ruby's shame, she was beginning to realize, was the shame of having to live up to that judgment just to survive. A few days later, Claire found her. The work of rebuilding a corner of the barn had begun, a slow, arduous process. Claire had been gathering salvageable tools when she saw Ruby sitting alone amidst the charred timbers, her back to the cabin. Her shoulders were shaking. Claire hesitated, her first instinct to turn and walk away, to leave the other woman to her private grief. But the memory of Ruby's pained words, and the image of her dragging an unconscious Eli from the smoke, held her there. She walked over slowly and sat down on a blackened log a few feet away. She said nothing. Ruby hastily wiped at her eyes, her body tensing, expecting a taunt or a triumphant glare. But Claire just sat there, looking out at the scorched earth, sharing the silence. Minutes stretched by. The only sound was the wind whispering through the ruins. Finally, Ruby's sobs subsided into a shuddering quiet. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. But in that shared silence, in that moment of truce amidst the destruction, something shifted. A fragile, unspoken understanding was born from their mutual pain. That night, the weight of it all became too much for Claire. The fire, the jealousy, the kiss, the dawning, complicated empathy for her rival. It all coalesced into a wave of overwhelming emotion. Eli found her sitting outside the cabin, staring up at the moon, tears streaming silently down her face. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet question. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I came here to start a new life, to be useful, to find a place where I could be quiet, and instead, I'm in the middle of a war." "I never meant for any of this," he said, his own voice thick with a grief and confusion that matched her own. She turned to him then, her eyes searching his in the pale moonlight. "I know." And then, the truth, the simplest and most terrifying truth of all. came out of her. "I love you, Eli." I think I started to love the man who wrote that advertisement. The man who sounded so lonely and so decent. And despite everything that's happened, I still see him. I see him when you're gentle with the horses. I see him when you look at that juniper tree on the hill. I love him. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Love was a word he had buried. He had not allowed himself to think it, let alone hear it. He looked at her, at this quiet, strong woman who had endured lies and scandal and fire, who had offered him a loyalty he had so carelessly betrayed. And in that moment, the fever for Ruby receded, and all he felt was a profound, aching tenderness for the woman before him. He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time, it was not hesitant or painful. It was a conscious choice. It was slow and deep, a conversation without words. He led her back into the cabin. Ruby, on her pallet, feigned sleep, her body perfectly still, her breathing even. Eli laid his bedroll out, and there, on the floor of the cabin, in the flickering firelight, they made love for the first time. It was not a frantic coupling like his encounters with Ruby. It was a slow, quiet claiming. It was a mending of something broken, an affirmation of a connection that had survived in spite of everything. But they were not alone. From her pallet, Ruby watched. Through the smallest crack between her eyelids, she saw it all. She saw the tenderness in his touch, the reverence in his gaze. She saw him kiss Claire's forehead, her eyelids, the hollow of her throat. She saw an intimacy she had offered him with her body, but that he had given to Claire with his soul. She lay there, unmoving, as a cold, silent rage built inside her, freezing out the pain, leaving only a hard, diamond-sharp resolve. The next day, she waited until Claire had gone down to the creek to fetch water. Eli was in the cabin, checking the stock of his rifle. Ruby came up behind him, silent as a cat. She pressed her body against his back, her arms snaking around his waist. He tensed, ready to pull away, but she held him fast. She turned him around, her eyes blazing, and kissed him. A rough, demanding kiss that was all anger and possession. She pushed him back toward his bedroll, her movements efficient and wordless. It was a swift, brutal seduction, an act of defiance, a reassertion of her claim. When it was over, she lay beside him, her breathing still harsh. She propped herself up on one elbow and looked down at him, her expression cold and analytical. "Tell me something, Eli," she said, her voice devoid of all warmth. "When you're inside me, who do you dream of?" The question hung in the air, a cruel, glittering knife. He had no answer. He just stared at the log ceiling, feeling trapped. A man caught in a snare of his own making, torn between a duty he felt to Claire's heart, a desire he couldn't deny for Ruby's body, a love he was too afraid to name, and a guilt that was heavy enough to smother them all. Later that afternoon, while Eli was out on the range, Ruby was straightening his bedroll, a task she never performed. Her hand brushed against something hard beneath it. She reached under the rough wool, and her fingers closed around the smooth wooden handle of a large skinning knife. She pulled it out. The blade was clean, recently sharpened. She stared at it, and her blood ran cold. She saw Jude Laskin's face, heard Silas's warning. He'll come for her, and now, this, a knife under his bed. To her, the conclusion was swift and certain. He had made his choice. He had chosen Claire, and he was preparing to get rid of the trouble, to cut away the complications she represented. He was going to throw her out, or worse. The fear, the deep, animal fear she had been running from, seized her. She scrambled to her feet. She went to the corner where her meager belongings were kept, a single carpet bag, and began to throw her things inside. Her hands trembled, her movements jerky and panicked. She had to leave. She had to run before he could act. Claire came back into the cabin, her water buckets full. She stopped short when she saw Ruby packing. The open bag, the wild, terrified look in her eyes. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving," Ruby snapped, not looking at her. "It's what he wants. It's what you want." "That's not true," Claire said, setting the buckets down. "No one wants you to leave." "Don't lie to me," Ruby spat, whirling to face her, the knife still clutched in her hand. "I found this under his bed. I know what it means. I'm not waiting around to find out if he uses it to cut me loose or to cut my throat." Claire's eyes widened at the sight of the knife, then filled with a sudden, pained understanding. "Ruby, no, that's for skinning hides. It's a tool. It has nothing to do with you." She took a step closer. "Please, don't go." Ruby laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Why? So you can have him all to yourself? So you can play the happy wife in your clean little cabin?" "No," Claire said, her voice pleading now. "Because he needs you." The words surprised her as much as they did Ruby. "You don't see it, but I do. You saved him in the fire. He was ready to die, and you pulled him out. You're the part of him that's still fighting. I think he needs that fight. I think he needs you too." Ruby stared at her, her fury and fear warring with a profound, disorienting confusion. She looked at the earnest, tear-filled eyes of the woman she considered her rival, the woman who was now begging her to stay. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving her looking lost and suddenly very young. That night, no one spoke. They sat at the small table for dinner. The three of them. The food was tasteless in their mouths. The air was not silent. It was charged, humming with the energy of all the things that had happened. It was thick with the heat of Ruby's fear, Claire's plea, and Eli's suffocating guilt. It was the heat of something raw and unspeakable that had been born between them. Something that had no name, simmering in the small, quiet cabin in the middle of the vast, lonely desert. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the backs of 4 tired horses. For weeks, a strange peace had settled over the ranch. It was not a comfortable peace, but a watchful one, born from Claire's plea and Ruby's terrified uncertainty. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate grace, the unspoken truce holding them in a delicate balance. The work of rebuilding the barn had become their shared penance, a physical outlet for the tension that still hummed between them. Eli was splitting logs when he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the brassy afternoon sky. They were not cowboys. They rode with a lazy arrogance, their posture speaking of towns and saloons, not open range. A cold knot formed in Eli's stomach. He dropped the axe and wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers, his eyes fixed on the approaching men. Claire saw them from the cabin, and a premonition, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, went through her. She had seen men like this before, men who loitered outside the saloon in her Missouri town, their eyes full of a lazy menace. She looked for Ruby and saw her standing stock still by the half-finished barn, her face a mask of chalky white. The blood had drained from it, leaving only the stark green of her eyes, wide with a terror that was absolute. The lead rider was a man dressed in black, his coat and hat finer than the others, though coated in the same layer of trail dust. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with a thin mustache and eyes that were flat and dead, like polished stones. He reined in his horse a few yards from Eli and looked around, a slow, contemptuous smile playing on his lips. He took in the scorched earth, the half-built barn, the small, defiant cabin. His gaze dismissed it all as insignificant. Then his eyes landed on Ruby, and the smile widened into a predatory grin. "Well, now," he said, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that slid through the quiet air. "Look what the wind blew in. I was beginning to think you'd fallen off the edge of the earth, my dear, but it seems you've just found a hole to hide in." This was Jude Laskin. He was exactly as Eli had imagined him, and 100 times worse. She's not hiding, Eli said, stepping forward. He kept his hands open and away from his body. And she's not yours. This is my land. You and your men can turn around and ride back the way you came. Jude's dead eyes shifted to Eli. Taking his measure, he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Your land, this dusty little patch of hell? You can have it. I'm not here for the dirt. I'm here for my property. He nodded toward Ruby. The singer has a contract. It's time for her to come back and honor it. There's no contract, Ruby said, her voice trembling but laced with defiance. I owe you nothing. You owe me your obedience, Jude corrected her smoothly. And I've come to collect. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Either you ride out with me now, or my boys and I will burn this last little shack to the ground and take you from the ashes. It makes no difference to me. In fact, he added, his eyes glittering, I might enjoy the fire. Eli felt the cold rage building inside him, but he knew violence was a losing game. He was 1 man against 4. There's no need for that, he said, trying to keep his voice reasonable, to buy a few seconds of time. Let's talk this through. But Ruby knew Jude better. She knew there was no reasoning with him. There was only appeasement or destruction. She took a step forward, her chin high, her body a rigid line of sacrifice. All right, Jude, she said, her voice shaking. I'll go. Just leave them alone. They have nothing to do with this. Ruby, no, Eli said, starting toward her. One of Jude's men casually drew his pistol, the movement lazy but final. Eli stopped. At that exact moment, the cabin door creaked open. Claire stood in the doorway. In her hands, she held Eli's rifle. She was not a natural with the weapon. She held it stiffly, her knuckles white, but she held it steady, and it was aimed directly at Jude Laskin's chest. Get off this land, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. Jude stared at her, his smile faltering for the first time. He looked from the pale, determined woman in the doorway to the defiant woman in the yard, to the grim-faced man standing between them. His amusement curdled into annoyance. You've made some interesting friends, Ruby, he snarled. Looks like we'll have to do this the hard way after all. Everything happened at once. One of Jude's men, the one on his right, spurred his horse and drew his gun. But Eli had been waiting for a single, decisive moment. He lunged, not for his own gun, but for the rifle still holstered on his horse's saddle a few feet away. He was faster than the man on horseback. The world exploded in a deafening roar as Eli's rifle fired. The man in the saddle jerked backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, and toppled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Jude, screaming in rage, leaped from his horse and charged at Ruby. He was not reaching for a gun. His face was contorted with a desire to punish, to put his hands on her. But Ruby was not the same woman who had fled Dodge City. In her hand, seemingly from nowhere, was the large skinning knife she had found under Eli's bed. As Jude lunged for her, she did not retreat. She stepped into his attack, and the blade went with her, a flash of silver in the afternoon sun. Jude stopped, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at his stomach, where the handle of the knife protruded, then back up at her, his mouth opening in a silent, "Oh." A second shot rang out. The third man, firing wildly from his spooked horse, sent a bullet screaming past Eli's head. It ricocheted off the stone chimney of the cabin with a loud crack. Claire, still in the doorway, cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and staggered back a step. Clutching her arm, the fourth man, seeing his leader down and his partner dead, had no stomach for the fight. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge as quickly as he had come. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the whimpering of a horse and the soft, steady drip of blood onto the thirsty dust. Jude Laskin crumpled to the ground, The dead man lay still by his horse. Eli stood with the rifle in his hands, smoke curling from the barrel, his face a mask of grim shock. The scene was a tableau of brutal, final violence. The spell broke. Ruby let out a sound, a terrible, ragged sob that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of her soul. She stared at Jude's body, at the knife, at the blood on her hands, and she began to shake uncontrollably. Eli dropped the rifle and went to her, gathering her into his arms as she collapsed, her body racked with violent, weeping tremors. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring words that had no meaning, just the sound of a human voice in the wreckage. Claire stumbled out of the cabin, her face pale, her left sleeve stained with a rapidly spreading patch of crimson. The bullet had grazed her upper arm, a deep, burning furrow in the flesh. She looked at Ruby sobbing in Eli's arms, at the two bodies lying in the dust, and her mind struggled to comprehend the terrible, swift finality of it all. Without a word, her own pain forgotten, she went back into the cabin, tore a strip from a clean sheet, and came back out. She walked over to Ruby and began to silently, gently, clean the blood from her hands. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. They dragged the bodies to the far side of the ridge and buried them in shallow, rocky graves. The work was grim and silent. There were no words, no prayers. It was just the hard, physical reality of covering up a secret, of hiding their sin under the vast, indifferent sky. No law came. No one from town rode out to ask questions. Silas's warning had been a prophecy, and its fulfillment had left them utterly and completely alone. They were outside the world now, bound together by the blood they had shed. A few nights after the burials, Eli found Ruby sitting on the cabin steps, staring out at the darkness. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You don't have to go," he said into the silence. She didn't look at him. "You should have let me. None of this would have happened." "Maybe," he said. He looked at her then, at her profile in the faint starlight. "When I put that ad in the paper, I was looking for someone plain and hard-working, someone to cook and clean, someone quiet." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're not what I expected." He paused, and his voice grew softer, more serious. "But maybe you're what this place needs. You fight, you survive." I'd forgotten how to do that. He was not offering her love or even forgiveness. He was offering her a place. He was telling her she belonged. Inside the cabin, by the dim light of a single candle, Claire was stitching the torn sleeve of her dress. She had heard every word. A sharp, familiar pain went through her, the pain of being the second choice, the sensible choice, while the other was the necessary one. But underneath the heartbreak was something else, something she had felt that day in the barn, a strange, grudging understanding. Eli was right. Ruby's fire, the very thing that had terrified and repelled her, was the thing that had kept them all alive. The next afternoon, Ruby found Claire by the creek, washing the blood stains from the dress she had worn during the fight. "Why did you do it?" Ruby asked, her voice quiet, without its usual sharp edges. "You should have been happy to see me go. Why did you beg me to stay?" Claire stopped scrubbing and looked at her hands in the clear, running water. She thought for a long moment, searching for the truth, a truth that was more complicated than simple rivalry. "Because it wouldn't have been enough for him," she said softly. She looked up and met Ruby's eyes. "I thought I was what he needed. The quiet, the calm, a home. But that's only half of it. You're the other half. The fire, the fight." She took a deep breath, the admission costing her dearly. "I begged you to stay because I saw he'd already chosen both of us. He just didn't know it yet." From that day on, the truce became something more solid. It became an unspoken alliance. They began to share the chores without discussion. Claire would cook, and Ruby would clean the dishes. Ruby would help Eli with the brutal work of rebuilding the barn, her movements surprisingly strong and efficient. While Claire would tend to her garden and mend their clothes, they began to talk, softly at first, about small, impersonal things: the weather, the lack of rain, the stubbornness of a particular horse, the intense desert heat, which had once been a backdrop, now felt like a part of them, a constant, simmering pressure that mirrored the unspoken desires and the shared trauma that bound them together. One night, weeks later, a storm broke. It was not a gentle rain, but a violent thunderstorm that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Lightning lit up the small room in stark, flashing tableaus, and thunder cracked directly overhead. Claire, who had always been afraid of storms, stood by the small window, watching the deluge. Eli came up behind her, his presence a warm, solid weight in the chaotic darkness. He didn't speak, but he wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her like that for a long time as the storm raged. "I love your heart, Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "It's the anchor in all of this." Later, after the worst of the storm had passed, he saw Ruby standing by the door, staring out into the rain-washed night. She looked restless, a caged animal. He walked over and stood before her. He put his hands on the door on either side of her head, trapping her there. She looked up at him, her green eyes wary and defiant. "You saved my soul, Ruby," he said, his voice low and raw. "I was already dead. You woke me up." He leaned in and kissed her, not with the desperate hunger of before, but with a fierce, grateful tenderness. That night, for the first time, all three of them slept in the same room. The loft was empty. Claire was on her pallet, Ruby on hers, and Eli on his bedroll by the dying embers of the fire. The rain tapped gently on the roof, in the deep, quiet darkness. A hand reached out across the small space between the beds. A moment later, another hand found it, their fingers intertwining. A third hand joined, covering the other two. No one spoke a word. There were no words for what they had become. There was only the rain, the darkness, and the silent, certain pressure of their hands, clasped together against the vast, empty loneliness of the world. The seasons turned. The raw, blackened scar on the land from the fire was slowly covered by the stubborn green of new grass. The sun baked the earth, the rains came, and the desert bloomed with a fierce, fragile beauty. With the turning of the seasons, a new life took root at the Barbie Ranch. It was a life forged in violence and necessity, and it grew with the same tough, resilient spirit as the wild sage that clung to the hills. Months passed, and the ranch, which had been teetering on the edge of failure, began to thrive. The new section of the barn was completed, its fresh-cut pine a pale gold against the weathered gray of the cabin. The herd grew, fattened by a summer of good grass. Claire's vegetable garden, once a small, hopeful patch, now overflowed with corn, beans, and squash, its bounty lining the shelves of the cabin in colorful glass jars. The ghosts that had haunted Eli seemed to have receded, pushed back by the constant, demanding presence of the living. They found a rhythm, the three of them, a silent choreography of shared existence. Eli and Ruby worked the cattle together. She rode as if she had been born in a saddle, her laughter carrying on the wind as she cut a stray calf from the herd, her wildness finding a purpose in the vast, open spaces. She was a natural, her quick instincts and fearless energy a perfect match for the unpredictable nature of the work. Eli would watch her, a small, quiet smile touching his lips, a look of profound, wondering respect in his eyes. Claire, in turn, found her own place. Every Friday, she would ride the wagon into Redemption. She had started a small school in a spare room behind the general store, teaching the town's handful of children how to read and write. It was a role that suited her, and in the focused attention of her students, she found a piece of the life she thought she had lost forever. She was no longer the shamed woman from Missouri. She was teacher, a figure of quiet authority and gentle knowledge. The town, however, watched. The whispers followed Claire down the dusty street. The women in the mercantile would fall silent when she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of condemnation and a prurient, insatiable curiosity. They all knew the story, or a version of it. They knew two women had arrived for one man, and that both had stayed. They saw Eli Barrett come to town, flanked by his two women, one dark and fiery, the other fair and serene, and they did not know what to make of it. Rumors swirled like dust devils, tales of sin and debauchery under that lonely roof. But no one dared confront Eli. There was a new hardness in his eyes, a quiet confidence that discouraged questions. His ranch was succeeding, his cattle were healthy, and in the West, a man's success was a powerful shield. It silenced most, but not all. The new preacher arrived in the fall. His name was Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man with a voice like fire and brimstone and eyes that burned with a righteous fury. He had come to cleanse the town of its sins, and he saw sin everywhere. His gaze fell upon the strange household at the Barbee Ranch, and he found his perfect sermon. It was a Sunday morning in late October. The small adobe church was filled, the air cool and smelling of dust and dried flowers. Eli, Claire, and Ruby sat together in a pew near the back. As they had started to do, it was a silent act of defiance, a refusal to hide. Reverend Miller climbed into the pulpit, his black coat stark against the whitewashed wall. He opened his Bible, but he did not read from it. He stared out at the congregation, his eyes sweeping over them until they came to rest on the back pew. "There is a sickness in this town," he thundered, his voice filling the small space. "A sickness of the soul. We tolerate vice in our midst. We turn a blind eye to depravity, and we call it minding our own business. But the Lord does not mind his own business. The Lord sees all." A nervous shifting went through the pews. The townsfolk knew where this was going. "I speak of the sin of the flesh," the preacher roared, his finger now pointing, a trembling, accusatory rod, toward the back of the church. "I speak of women of sin, Jezebels who live without the sanctity of marriage, who share a roof and, God forbid, a bed with a man who is not their husband. This is an abomination, a stain upon our community, a mockery of all that is decent and holy." Ruby, who had been staring straight ahead, flinched as if struck, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She did not look down, but a deep, burning flush crept up her neck. Eli's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He started to rise, a low growl of anger in his chest. But before he could, Claire put a hand on his arm, and then she stood up. The entire congregation turned to look at her. She stood alone in the back pew, a small, slender figure in a simple gray dress. She was trembling, her entire body shaking with a mixture of terror and resolve. But she did not sit down. She looked directly at Reverend Miller, her brown eyes clear and steady. "You are mistaken, Reverend," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the shocked silence of the church, it carried to every corner. It was the voice of a schoolteacher, calm, precise, and full of an unassailable authority. "The woman you speak of," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength, "the woman you call a Jezebel, saved that man's life." She gestured toward Eli. "When fire threatened to consume our home, she pulled him from the smoke when he could no longer breathe. When a violent man came to our door, a man from her past, a past I cannot imagine, she was willing to sacrifice herself to protect us. And when that violence fell upon us, she fought. She did not cower. She bled." She took a breath, her gaze sweeping over the astonished faces of the townspeople, the women who had whispered about her, the men who had stared. "You speak of sin," she said, her voice now ringing with a passion no one had ever heard from her. "I have seen sin. It is the lie that destroys a reputation. It is the judgment that is passed without knowledge. It is the cruelty that hides behind a pious word. This woman, and here she turned and placed her hand on Ruby's shoulder, is not a sin. She is a survivor, and her presence in our home is not a stain. It is a blessing. She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remained standing for a moment longer, a silent challenge, before slowly sitting back down. Beside her, Ruby was frozen, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. A single perfect tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She simply stared at Claire, her green eyes full of a raw, wounded, and profoundly grateful light. The silence in the church was absolute. Reverend Miller stood in his pulpit, his mouth agape, his sermon shattered. He had no response. After a long, awkward moment, he stammered his way to a closing prayer, and the service was over. No one spoke to them as they left, but the stares were different now. The condemnation had been replaced by a grudging respect, a dawning, confused understanding. The women of the town looked at Claire, and then at Ruby, and they saw not a sinner and a saint, but two women bound by a loyalty that was fiercer than any judgment. The ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of the weight of what had happened. That night, after a silent dinner, Eli looked at the two of them, his face serious in the lamplight. "We need to settle this," he said, his voice low. "For the world and for ourselves." Claire looked at him, her heart catching. Ruby tensed, her old fears rising. "I can't offer what another man could," Eli went on, his gaze moving from Claire's face to Ruby's and back again. "I can't give you a piece of paper from a preacher or a judge. The world wouldn't allow it, and I don't think that's what we are, anyway." He stood up and walked to the hearth, resting his hand on the rough stone mantel. He looked at the home they had built together from the ashes. "So I'm proposing something else," he said, turning back to them. His voice was steady, his eyes full of a deep, certain emotion. "Not marriage, unity, no vows. Just this land, our word, and the nights we don't survive alone." The simple, unadorned words hung in the quiet cabin. Ruby let out a small, choked sound. The tears she had held back in the church now fell freely, silent tears of a pain being washed away, of a lifetime of being worth nothing finally being told she was worth everything. A slow, radiant smile spread across Claire's face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. This was better than a vow. It was a truth. She stood up and went to him. Ruby followed a moment later. They stood before him, and without a word, Claire reached up and kissed him, a kiss of deep, abiding love. Then she stepped back, and Ruby stepped forward. She put her hands on his chest and pressed her lips to his, a kiss of fierce, passionate gratitude. He had not asked them to choose. He had chosen them both. The final, emotional climax came a week later. With the first light of dawn, the air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. They saddled their horses, the three of them, and rode out, not to work, but simply to ride. They urged the horses into a gallop, their laughter echoing in the quiet morning as they raced across the open plain. They were free, a small, defiant trinity under a vast, endless sky. They were a family, claimed and alive in a world that still did not understand them, and they no longer cared. As the sun climbed higher, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold, Eli reined in his horse. They had come to the edge of the burned section of land. Before them stood a lone, skeletal juniper, its branches blackened and twisted, a stark monument to the fire that had almost destroyed them. Eli dismounted and walked to the tree. He reached out and laid his hand on the charred bark, his touch surprisingly gentle. Claire and Ruby watched him, their horses standing quietly beside them. "We came through hell," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the burned tree. "And this is still our land." He turned back to them, his face illuminated by the rising sun. In his eyes, they saw not a broken man, but a whole one. A man remade by the two impossible women who had come into his life. He had sought a wife to fill a silence, and instead, he had found a life. Louder and more complicated and more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. They didn't ask the world to understand them, just to let them love how they bled for it. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale. We'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more stories. And please share your thoughts with us in English.